Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. On this occasion, we are from the fifth group that consisting of Dila Putri Emyama, Nabila Duratun Hamida, Nanik Miftahul Zulaikah, Rusdatul Isma, Fedawati Prameswari, and myself, Siska Yuning Tias, will present our topic about ecosystems and restoration ecology. Number 1. General description. Observing the ecosystem. Ecosystem is an ecological system formed by an inseparable reciprocal system between living things and the environment, created from two components. An ecosystem can include a large area such as a forest, or a microcosm such as the space under a fallen log or a small pond. Like populations and communities, the boundaries of ecosystems are sometimes unclear. Some ecologists think of the entire biosphere as a global ecosystem, a combination of all the local ecosystems on Earth. Ecosystem dynamic involve two processes that cannot be fully explained by population or community phenomena: flow of energy and cycles of chemical elements. Energy enters most ecosystems as sunlight, which is then converted into chemical energy by autotrophs, passed on by heterotrophs, and discharged as heat. Chemical elements are returned in inorganic form to the environment through the metabolism of organisms. The law of physics regulates the flow of energy and the cycles of chemical elements in ecosystem. Ecologists of ecosystems study the transformation of energy and matter within a system and measures the amount of energy and matter that crosses the boundaries of that system. By grouping the species in the community into traffic levels of the food-to-eat relationship, we can follow energy transformations in an ecosystem and map the movement of chemical elements. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but can only be transferred or transformed. Thus, we can calculate the transfer of energy through an ecosystem from its input as solar radiation to its release as heat from organisms. Photosynthetic organisms convert solar energy into chemical energy without changing the total amount of energy. The amount of energy stored in organic molecules plus the amount reflected and wasted as heat must be proportional to the total energy solar captured. Also, the second law of thermodynamics states that any energy exchange increases the entropy of the universe. Is that energy conversion cannot be entirely efficient. Some energy is always lost as heat. The energy that flows through an ecosystem is ultimately discharged into space as heat. So if the sun doesn't supply energy constantly to the earth, most ecosystems will die out. This idea shows that we can measure the efficiency of the conversion of ecological energy in the same way as measuring the efficiency of light bulbs and car machines. Conservation of mass. Matter, just like energy, cannot be created or destroyed. The nature of mass is eternal, so that we can determine how many chemical elements are recycled within an ecosystem or acquired or lost over time. Unlike energy, the chemical elements are constantly recycled in pollutants. Though not lost on a global scale, the elements move between cemented ecosystems, input and output. In a forest ecosystem, for example, much of the mineral nutrient that plants obtain from the soils as dust or dissolved substances in rainwater or just under rocks. Nitrogen is also supplied through a biological process called nitrogen fixing. On the side of the output, gases return elements to the atmosphere, while water transports materials such as organisms. Ecosystems are open systems of energy and mass and release waste, products, and heat. Much of the input and output is small compared with the amount recycled in the ecosystem. Still, the balance between input and output determines whether an ecosystem is the source of certain elements. If the output of a mineral nutrient exceeds its input, it will eventually limit production in the system. Human activities often greatly alter the balance of input and output. Energy, mass, and trophic levels. Ecologists rate species into a trophy based on the main source of nutrition and energy, the levels of the trophy that ultimately support all other parts of the autotrophs, also called primary producers of the ecosystem. Most of them are photosynthetic organisms that use light energy to synthesize sugar and other organic compounds that are then used as fuel for cellular respiration and as building material for growth. The organisms at the trophy level above the primary producers are heterotroph, both directly and indirectly dependent on the primary manufacturer's biosynthetic output. Herbivore that eats other primary plants and manufacturers are primary consumer. The carnivorous secondary consumer, while the four that feeds on another carnivorous are tertiary consumer. Another important heterotrophic group is detritivore. Detritivore or detritus is a consumer who derives energy from detritus, which is non-living organic material such as the remains of dead organisms, feces, fallen leaves, and wood. Much detritivore eventually gets eaten by a secondary and tertiary consumer. The two important detritivore groups are the prokaryotes and fungus. These organisms secrete enzymes that digest organic matter. They then absorb the decomposition products, linking the consumer and primary producers in an ecosystem. In forests, for example, birds feed on earthworms that have eaten leaf litter and related prokaryotes and fungi. Detritivores play an important role in recycling chemical elements back to primary producers. This role is even more important than channeling resources from producers to consumers. Detritivores convert organic matters from all trophic levels into anorganic compounds that can be used by primary producers, thus closing the cycle of chemical elements in the ecosystem. If decompositions were stopped, all life on Earth would also stop when detritus builds up and the supply of chemicals for the synthesis of new organic matter is run out.
The next matter is energy and other limiting factors control primary production and ecosystems. The amount of alike energy that converted to chemical in the form of organic compounds by autotrophs during a given time period is the ecosystem's primary production. When chemoautotrophs are the primary producers, the initial energy input is chemical and the initial products are the organic compounds synthesized by the microorganisms. These photosynthetic products are the starting point for most studies of ecosystem metabolism and energy flow, as you can see in this picture. Next is ecosystem energy budget. Global energy budget. Each day, Earth's atmosphere is bombarded by a lot of solar radiation, but only a small fraction of the sunlight that reaches Earth's surface is used in photosynthesis. The rest is transmitted, reflected, or lost as heat. As a result, only about 1% of the visible light that strikes photosynthetic organisms is converted to chemical energy. Next is gross and net production. Gross primary production. The primary production in ecosystem is known as that ecosystem's gross primary production or GPP. GPP is the amount of energy from light or chemicals in the chemoautotrophic system converted to chemical energy of organic molecules per unit time. Next is net primary production. Net primary production or NPP is the net amount of primary production after the costs of plant respiration are included. NPP is equal to GPP minus the energy used for their autotrophic respiration. NPP is the key measurement because it represents the storage of chemical energy that will be available to consumers' ecosystem. Next is net ecosystem production. Net primary production can be stated as the amount of biomass added in a given period of time. Net ecosystem production, or NEP, is a measure of the total biomass accumulation during that time. NPP is defined as GPP, means the total respiration of all organisms in a system. NEP is useful to ecologies because its value determines whether an ecosystem is gaining or losing carbons over time. The next is primary production in aquatic ecosystem. In aquatic, marine, and freshwater ecosystems, both light and nutrients are important to controlling the primary production. The first is light limitation. As we know before, light drives photosynthesis that control the primary production in the ecosystems. In the aquatic ecosystem, one of the limiting factors is light quantity and light quality. The depth of light penetrations affects primary production throughout the photic zone of an ocean or lake. About half of the solar radiation is absorbed in the first 15 meters of water, and in clear water, only 5 to 10% of the radiation may reach a depth of 75 meters. The second is nutrient limitation. A limiting nutrient is the element that must be added for production to increase. The nutrient that often limiting marine production is either nitrogen or phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting phytoplankton growth, which we know that phytoplankton has given contribution around 95% of primary production in the ocean. Besides that, not only macronutrient nitrogen and phosphorus that limit aquatic production, based on experiments in the Sargasso Sea, micronutrients iron also limits the primary production in the aquatic system. So this is the table, the nutrient enrichment experiment for Sargasso samples that revealed that iron micronutrient is the one of the factors that control the primary production in aquatic ecosystem. Next is primary production in terrestrial ecosystem. Terrestrial ecosystems rely almost exclusively on sun's energy to support growth and metabolism of their resident organisms. The main factors controlling the primary production in terrestrial ecosystem are temperature and moisture. Tropical rainforests with their warm and wet conditions promote plants' growth are the most productive of all terrestrial production. In contrast, low productivity systems are generally hot and dry like a mini desert. Soil and terrain also limiting the production of terrestrial ecosystem. As an aquatic ecosystem, nitrogen and phosphorus also control the primary production. These nutrients are needed by the plants to grow.
Okay, now I will explain about production efficiency. So secondary production is going to be the amount of chemical energy in consumers' food that is converted to their own biomass during a given time period. Production efficiency is the percentage of energy stored in assimilated food that is not used for respiration or eliminated as waste. In this picture, when we look at the plant material that eaten by the caterpillar, we have 200 joules the total, and of those 200 joules were eaten by the caterpillar. 100 joules was lost to phases, so that was not assimilated. And over here, the other 100 joules was assimilated. 67 joules was lost to cellular respiration, so that's not going to be included in our secondary productions. However, 33 joules that was converted into energy that would be used for growth and to produce new biomass. Since it was used to produce new biomass, the 33 joules would be considered to be part of a secondary production. So to figure out the percentage of secondary production or production efficiency, we will take net secondary productions times 100% divided by assimilation of primary production. So for birds and mammals, typically have a production efficiency from 1 until 3%. Okay, now in the next slide, I will explain about traffic efficiency. The loss of energy with each transfer in a food chain can be represented by a pyramid of net production. The width of each tier is proportional to the net production, expressed in joules of each traffic level. The highest level, which represents top-level predators, contains relatively few individuals. The small population size typical of top predator species is one reason they tend to be vulnerable to extinction. And now look at this picture. This example assumes a traffic efficiency of 10% for each link in the food chains. Notice that primary producers convert only about 1% of the energy available to them to net primary production. So we are losing energy at each level. And that's because the organism has to survive. It does respiration. So we are losing heat at each level. And so we are losing a huge amount of energy at each step along the way. Okay, now we will talk about biomass pyramid. So biomass pyramid in which each tier represents the standing crop, the total dry mass of an organism in one trophic level. Most biomass pyramids narrow sharply from primary producers at the base to top-level carnivores at the apex because energy transfers between trophic levels are so inefficient. We can see in the first pyramids of biomass, most biomass pyramids show a sharp decrease in biomass at successively higher trophic levels. And certain aquatic ecosystems, however, have inverted biomass pyramids. Primary consumers outweigh the producer. Such inverted biomass pyramids occur because the producers of phytoplankton grow, reproduce, and are consumed so quickly by the zooplankton that they never develop a large population size or standing crop. So we can see in the second pyramid of biomass, in some aquatic ecosystem, such as the English Channel, a small standing crop of primary producers, phytoplankton, supports a larger standing crop of primary consumers, zooplankton. So we can see here, primary consumers, zooplankton, is larger than the primary producers, phytoplankton.
The next material is a biological and geochemical process cycle nutrients and water in ecosystem. Biogeochemical cycle. The biogeochemical cycle is a transfer of chemical elements to living things and abiotic environment such as soil and water. Biogeochemical cycle serve to regulate the balance of ecosystem, meaning that the balance of ecosystem depends on rotating repetition of certain chemical elements. Other elements, including phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, are too heavy to occur as gases at Earth's surface. Although they are transported in Dutch in terrestrial ecosystem, these elements cycle more locally, absorbed from the soil by plant root and eventually return to the soil by decomposer. And the next slide is exploring water and nutrient cycling. The water cycle. In the first point, from available to live liquid water is the primary physical phase in which water is used. Thought, some organisms can have water vapor. Freezing of soil water can limit water availability to terrestrial plate. The K process. The main process driving the water cycle are evaporation of liquid water by solar energy, condensation of water vapor into cloud, and precipitation. Transpiration by terrestrial plates also move large volume of water into the atmosphere. Surface and groundwater flow can return water to the oceans, completing the water cycle. The carbon cycle. The key process is photosynthesis by plant and phytoplankton remove substantial amount of atmosphere CO2 each year. This quality is approximately equaled by CO2 added to the atmosphere through cellular respiration by produce and consumer. The burning of fossil fuels and wood is adding significant amount of additional CO2 to the atmosphere. Over geologic time, volcanoes are also substantial sources of CO2. The nitrogen cycle. The K process is the major pathway from nitrogen to enter an ecosystem is via nitrogen fixation. The conversion of nitrogen to form that can be used to synthesize organic nitrogen compounds. Certain bacteria, as well as lightning, fix nitrogen naturally. Nitrogen inputs from human activity now outpace natural inputs on land. Two measures contributes are industrial products, fertilizer, and legume crops that fix nitrogen via bacteria in their root noodle. And the next slide is the phosphor cycle. In first point, reservoirs the large accumulation of phosphor are is sedimentary rock of marine origin. There are also large quantity of phosphor in soil, in the ocean, and in organisms. Because soil particle bin PO4 the recycling of phosphorus then to be quite location in ecosystem. The K process, weathering of rock gradually adds PO4 to soil, some leach into groundwater and surface water, and may actually reach the sea. Phosphate taken up by proteins and incorporated into biological molecules may be eaten by consumer. Phosphate in return to soil or water by either decomposition of biomass or extraction by consumer. Because there are no significant phosphor contained case, only relatively small amount of purpose move to the atmosphere, usually in the form of dust and sea spray.
Human activities dominate most chemical cycles on Earth. As the human population has grown rapidly in size, our activities and capabilities have disrupted the traffic structure, energy flow, and chemical cycling of ecosystems. In fact, most chemical cycles are now influenced by human activities than by natural processes. Nutrition enrichment. Human activity often removes nutrient from one part of the biosphere and adds them to another. Humans have altered nutrient cycles so much that we can no longer understand any cycle without taking this effect. We can see that picture is the plant fertilization of corn. The negative impact from nutrient enrichment is eutrophication, and it contaminates the marine ecosystem. So many fish and reefs will die. Acid precipitation, or acid rain as we know, is because burning of fossil fuels, coal and oil, and also wood, burning wood. They are releases oxides of sulfur and nitrogen that reacting with water in atmosphere, then forming sulfuric and nitric acid. Acid precipitation is a regional problem arising from local emissions, greenhouse gases, and global warming. Greenhouse gas, greenhouse gas, the greenhouse effect is a natural process that warms the Earth's surface. When the sun's energy reaches the Earth's atmosphere, some of it is reflected back to space and rest is absorbed and re-radiated by greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gas include water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and some artificial chemicals such as chlorofluorocarbon CFCs. Then, global warming is the long-term heating of Earth's climate system observed since the pre-industrial period to human activities, primarily fossil fuel burning, which increase heat trapping greenhouse gas levels in Earth's atmosphere. Depletion of atmosphere ozone. The ozone layer reduces the penetration of UV radiation through the atmosphere. Human activities like releasing chlorine pollutants are eroding the ozone layer.
Now I will present restoration ecology as the last topic from this chapter. Restoration ecology is the scientific study supporting the practice of ecological restoration. Ecological restoration itself is the process to repairing the damaged ecosystem. There are two strategies you can use for ecological restoration: bioremediation and biological augmentation. Bioremediation is a method to treat contaminated soil, groundwater, and other environments. This method using organisms such as prokaryote, fungi, and plants that can adapt and live in contaminated environments. These organisms will produce enzymes to detoxify contaminants in the soil and other environments. Some of the organisms you can use for bioremediation are sunflower, date palms, poplar trees, etc. Biological augmentation is a method that uses organisms to add some important material such as chemical nutrients that have been gone from the environment. The purpose of this method is to degrade the pollutants by using organisms. Exploring ecological restoration. An example of ecological restoration practice happened in alpine ecosystem. The nitrogen-fixing plants such as lupin planted there to increase the available nitrogen in soil.